make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that is held in common, and this is certainly true of the CREC, is they want all of the media to come from one place, right? Like if you're a constituent or a member of that church or that denomination, there's an emphasis on consuming media that is produced in-house or produced through the network of churches that espouses that denomination, right?
Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, we are so glad to have you. I am your political host, Will Wright. Your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram, is out doing things for God, so he won't be here with us. But joining us this week is Dr. Samuel P. Perry, who is a scholar of rhetoric and public discourse at Baylor University. His work focuses on how race and religion intersect in American political life, especially within the Christian right. He's the author of Rhetorics of Race and Religion on the Christian Right, and his research has been featured in top journals exploring how public rhetoric shapes our understanding of race, politics, and faith. But today we are going to talk to him about something that you probably haven't heard much of, but will have pretty large implications on how our government is ran, and that is called the CREC. And we'll define what that means here in a minute. But welcome to the show, Sam.
Thanks for having me.
And I should mention to our podcast listeners that are not watching the video, you are not the other Sam Perry that has been on our show before. So I just want to point that out, right? I mean, you're not that Sam Perry, I don't think.
No, lovely guy, but no relation.
Guys, so we brought you on the show to talk about the CREC, CREC, which is this acronym that stands for what?
The Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches.
Awesome. And what is the CREC? Like, why are they so important? And why did you actually choose to write an article about it in Salon and The Conversation and other places?
I've written previously for The Conversation, and I had an established relationship with a religion editor there, and she knows something of my work in terms of looking at some of the foundational Christian right stuff in terms of where some of the thought processes are coming from. And the co-founder of the CREC, Doug Wilson, is leaning heavily into some of the stuff that I've already researched for previous projects. And because my first book looked at kind of rhetorics and the way that the war on terror operated and primed people in the United States to be more sympathetic or more receptive to arguments coming from the Christian right, especially when it came to circulating conspiracy theories about Obama on the basis of race and religion. She approached me and asked me if I would write this piece kind of explaining the implications for someone like Pete Hegseth being a member of the CREC and what that might mean for a high-ranking government official with the Secretary of Defense to be in charge of something, one of the largest labor force in the United States. That person is going to be able to put their ideological thumbprint on a lot of this. And so that's kind of where it started. I had been kind of primed by a couple of colleagues a few months earlier. Wasn't anything that I necessarily would have expected to be talking about, but usually when people hear depressing things or like bad things, especially when they're happening in terms of things that are maybe happening on the Christian right, especially as they might pertain to race, people will come to me and go, "Oh, I thought of you when I read this." And I'm like, "Oh, well."
You're like, thanks.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how to feel about that, but okay. So I'd already been listening to Heath Drusen's podcast, Extremely American, and he's a reporter in Moscow, Idaho, where the CREC is headquartered and where Doug Wilson has been operating for, decades at this point. And then a colleague turned me on to the podcast Sons of Patriarchy, which is hosted by Peter Bell. And that podcast focuses really heavily on survivors' stories and people who have been able to leave the church. And it's a tough listen, but it's sort of spurred from a lot of the reporting that Sarah Stancorp did, looking at the stories of people who came out of that church and had experienced trauma or violence or otherwise abusive behavior.
Yeah. So my my first experience with Doug Wilson was probably about 4 years ago. I haven't met the person, but just understanding of who he is and kind of what he's all about was we had Stephen Wolfe on our show, who wrote the book, Case for Christian Nationalism. And, as we do with most of our interviews, we kind of do our research, we do our digging. He was published by Canon Press, which is connected to Doug Wilson. And I want to talk all about the Canon Press part, but I'd love maybe just for us to kind of set the stage, because we're talking about the CREC, the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches, which was started by Doug Wilson. But who is Doug Wilson? Maybe we can start there, and then we can kind of walk forward to the Pete Hegseth thing.
Yeah. So Wilson is from Moscow, Idaho. His father had been a pastor there, and Wilson found his own way into ministry, and it's sort of an interesting trajectory, right? Because he sort of styles himself as someone who wanted to do youth ministry and was kind of hip to the kind of university town life. And he went to the university there, University of Idaho, and received an education, a secular education at that. But he stayed there and began preaching, and then decided that he needed to found a church that was more in line with his own sort of theological beliefs. So he started Christ Church in Moscow. And one of the reasons he stayed in Moscow was he saw it as a town that was about the right size to do what his eventual goal is, which is to sort of be able to control Moscow through different arms of government and real estate by having a larger influence. So along the way, he started a private school, a classical Christian school, through his narrative, because they didn't want to send their children to a secular school. So they started the sort of network of schools. It begins in Moscow, and now there's this whole accreditation system associated with these schools and whatnot. Wow. And a whole set of classical Christian curriculum that is sold to various schools or that is used and implemented online for homeschools. And as it's often been, education is at the front line of these sort of culture wars, right? Because it becomes a means by which you can change narratives and, the formation of people in such a way that you move them gradually towards a point of view. And this is something that Hegseth picks up on that we should talk about later. But Hegseth, no formal training in education, but man, does he have a lot to say about it. That's true. So Wilson does that, and then at some point, his daughter's old enough to go to college, and he says, there's not a college out there that's Christian enough. So he starts New St. Andrews in Moscow as well, and has this small group of faculty, and they don't accept federal money, so they have a very different set of rules than what you would expect at any number of universities. I mean, I myself, coming from a fairly conservative cultural environment in terms of university life, if you go through the New St. Andrews website, it's very different than even other conservative Christian institutions across the country. So,
how did they compare to like the Claremont Institute?
I mean, there's some overlap, certainly in terms of economic policy and looking at sort of free market stuff as the ultimate goal. Now, that gets a little cloudy for any number of reasons, but they're pulling from these Christian reconstructionists who began writing prolifically in the late 1970s and into the 1980s. Predominantly two guys, R.J. Rushdoony and his then son-in-law, Gary North. And they wrote, just tomes on the implementation of biblical law at the sort of local, state, and federal level. But they were really, really into the Austrian school of economics. So total free market type stuff, Hayek and von Mises, this type of thing. And that's something that really gets picked up across some of these groups on the Christian right. So the Claremont Institute, the Acton Institute, any number of these sorts of, and they all have their own educational arms and have slightly different imprints. And but if they're not in the same sandbox, they're adjacent.
I gotcha. So Wilson creates this bit of an empire there in Moscow. Is it purely just like schools and churches, or does it expand greater than that? And does it leave Idaho?
Yeah. So, there are churches across the United States now. And let me be clear, it's not a huge denomination in terms of membership. This is not like the Southern Baptist Convention in terms of numbers, right? But I think one of the things that has been true since the late 1970s in particular is that some of these smaller denominations have gained more purchase and have been able to spread more freely. One, because of the way that the church planting and seeding model works for the CREC. Lay people can become preachers. There's not necessarily some of the same formalized processes in terms of starting a church. But moreover, I think one of the things that we see is that they're really good at creating content, right? So it's not, we think now of that in terms of like digital content, right? Like what we're doing right now. You mentioned having had Stephen Wolfe on. Stephen Wolfe has, just hours and hours of YouTube footage, right? Doug Wilson is the same way. And they're constantly interviewing people, often interviewing people who are within their same sort of circles, right? So it creates this self-sealing media ecology in which people are operating, where they're hearing the same things amplified over and over again, right? So, and that starts, it starts by being able to set up schools where that message can be reiterated over and over again, right? And in the CREC schools in particular, there's an emphasis on making dangerous children who are dangerous to the establishment, right? And a lot of the material on the websites and then material that is then published through Canon Press, which is their publishing arm, right, uses war metaphors and talks about spiritual warfare and cultural warfare, and promotes a very patriarchal version of masculinity that lends itself to kind of the breaking point of the metaphor. Like, when does the metaphor stop and this becomes literal? I think it can be really difficult to tell, especially when you're listening to some of the promotional materials that are being put online and some of the podcasters that spin out of this sort of media ecology. Militancy is encouraged, right? So it's very much a no compromise approach to both religion and politics, because for them there is no differentiation between religion and politics.
So with kind of this militant aspect of it, how much, like, is it just talk and blunder? Iron sharpens iron. Armor of God, like all those sort of like terms that a lot of on the religious right like to use. Like, how much of that has actually translated into action? To the best of your knowledge, like that you understand.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be clear as a rhetorician. I don't want to say that there's a one-to-one correlation between somebody saying thing and then an action taking place, but I do think you can create environments that are more likely to encourage treatment of other groups of people or marginalized groups, or that encourage a certain political animosity that can lead to other things, right? So just as an example, right, on the CREC website in their gift shop, in the lead up to the election, they had a lot of kind of products or, apparel, merchandise that use the slogan, "No Quarter November," right? So we can extrapolate that from that pretty easily. Okay, well, we know this is no surrender. It's November. It's election season. We get where they're going with this. There's not a lot of latitude in terms of being able to choose one or the other candidate, at least at the top of the ticket. And stay within the reading or the sort of worldview that's being promoted. But one of the products was a flamethrower that said "No Quarter November" on it. And you're like, well, what are we to do with this "No Quarter November" flamethrower, right? Like, this is nothing if not an enthymeme about where to go with these things. So, I mean, like I said, I don't want to overstate, but I do think it's important to, if you are in a media ecology, in an environment where you're constantly being encouraged to fight, eventually people are inclined to fight. Now, does that become blustery rhetoric? Does it become Pete Hegseth doing burpees on his social media channel to show, what good shape he's in? Maybe that's the conclusion of it, but I worry about other things, certainly.
Yeah. So, the CREC has a lot of ideas that seem to be either adjacent or runs in parallel to what we know about Christian nationalism. Like, how would you kind of categorize the CREC kind of under the broad umbrella of Christian nationalism?
Well, we've already mentioned Stephen Wolfe, who's, openly supports Christian nationalism. But the core tenets are there, right? Religious test for office, I think, is one of these clear things that people who are studying this and people who are reporting on it keep coming back to and asking for explanations from Wilson and other authors who have made claims in work published by Canon Press, more specifically, saying, well, the Constitution pretty clearly states you can't have a religious test for office. And for them, it's a misreading of the Constitution, which you hear certain, I think Lauren Boebert has made reference to this as well, this misunderstanding of a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote. And it's like, well, I don't know that the Establishment Clause is there.
That's true. It's like it is in the Constitution.
Yeah. It's not new. That one was pretty hard and fast for a couple of reasons that led to the whole American Revolution. But, this is one of those things that narratively, I think, you ask what the reach of the CREC is, more broadly. I don't know that it's just the reach of the CREC that we need to be thinking about within the scope of a conversation like this. It's where are the sources that they're then using to create a media ecology that is really appealing to a lot of people coming from. So, right, there's a self-professed theologian named David Barton, right? I see you kind of laughing. Are you familiar with Barton? Yeah.
But maybe for the folks that aren't familiar with him, maybe you can give,
he wrote a book that became fairly popular in certain circles called Original Intent. And his claim is that there is no separation of church and state. essentially, that there can be a dominant religion that overrides the interest of the state, so long as the state doesn't mandate that religion be the state religion. So culturally, there can be a state religion, even if not formalized. And even that distinction ends up kind of breaking down in some of the claims that he makes. And he has a large repository or archive of documents and letters from the time of the founding of the country. Access to those documents is not always immediate. But he's been writing, and he's been a political influence since the 80s and early 90s, and some of his ideas have really caught on. He had a website that was pretty predominant for a while called Wall Builders, and there were people who had been elected to public office who were associated with wall builders as well. So it's not new, right? And I think looking at the little pieces of Christian reconstruction, or the little pieces that keep chipping away at the notion of what I think was once kind of sacrosanct as a political belief, that there is a separation of church and state in the United States, the uptake of the idea that maybe that's not the case, and it kind of drip feeding in through various forms of media across different evangelical denominations, has an effect politically over a period of time that may be more outsized than the size of one particular denomination, but instead the circulation of some of these texts and ideas that move from a theological fringe into a mainstream, right? Where you begin to see especially some of the stuff that's really prevalent within the context of what we might consider culture war type stuff, right? That some of these ideas that would have once been kind of harder to swallow or harder to stomach, or wouldn't have been maybe as readily publicly accepted, because they've circulated for so long and now they're coming from different corners and different circles and different denominations, we see, that argument may appear to be more common because of the type of circulation that it's getting than it actually is in terms of the general population's acceptance of that argument.
Yeah. Is that kind of like, we say God in the Pledge of Allegiance, we have God in our money, so we must be a Christian nation kind of thing? Yeah.
And I mean, it's worth pointing out, right? That's the Eisenhower administration. So that's not like unless we're saying the country was founded in the 1950s, and then I've got some right. But, and Kevin Cruz wrote a great book on that, One Nation Under God, where he talks about the roots of industrialism and capitalism kind of filtering into evangelical rhetorics and Christian spaces, and how the sort of conservative movement and the uptake of religious language really changed the American political landscape, right? So the under God stuff comes out of the Red Scare as well, right? So I think we have to think about the invocation of God in those terms, right? When God is being invoked out of fear, or in the context of a Cold War or a literal war, there are implications for that as well.
Yeah, it's so true. This is kind of an aside, for anybody that's interested in the topic of Christian nationalism or faith and politics. It's like the 1950s was like such a pretty hot like time. I mean, we're going to be talking to Amanda Tyler soon, but we're going to be talking about the Johnson Amendment. And Johnson Amendment came out of the 50s, like 1954,
Yeah.
So I'm just like, there's just such a center mass of the way our country looks that's grounded from the 1950s, which is, I don't know, it's just fascinating to me for some reason.
I think it's important to this conversation as well, because the post-war period coming out of World War II is when you begin to see a lot of different groups and different types of people entering the workforce, and you begin to see integration of both educational and work spaces, right? But one of the spaces that still remains heavily segregated within that time period is churches. Right. So, I mean, I hate to drop token Martin Luther King quotations, but, he was right about a lot of things, obviously. And, he said the most segregated hour in the country is 11 a.m. on Sunday morning. And it's shameful, and he was saying this in the context of that post-war period and leading into the civil rights movement. And a lot of what we see and what we recognize as Christian nationalism now began to form the basis of the modern version of this anyway, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, as these things begin to coalesce. And you see, again, and I'm going to come back to this word because it's something that I think is really important, this turn of phrase, the media ecology of it, right? Because you also see the advent of televisions in the home, and you see different types of messages being spread more widely than they would otherwise maybe be spread. So like the Jerry Falwells and Billy Grahams of the world are using these sorts of advances in technology. And then even a step beyond them, the Pat Robertsons of the world and the Dobsons and Focus on the Family, right? You see all of this, the LaHaye's and a lot of these things that influence where we're at now are coming out of that period, and they're a reaction in some senses to social change and demographic change, and not knowing how to interpret that within certain political and religious contexts.
You use the word media ecology, which I love the term, and I'm wondering is there like a theological like ecology or hermeneutical ecology, because it definitely seems that way, especially when you look at other sort of religious movements like the Seven Mountain Mandate, or whatever Robert Jeffress is doing, like that. There definitely seems to be sort of like networks of churches, although not affiliated, but are still preaching kind of the same message.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that is held in common, and this is certainly true of the CREC, is they want all of the media to come from one place, right? Like if you're a constituent or a member of that church or that denomination, there's an emphasis on consuming media that is produced in-house or produced through the network of churches that espouses that denomination, right? So, I grew up going to what I consider a fairly moderate Methodist church in North Houston. But I remember going to a youth retreat, and, you're like locked in for the weekend, and all of a sudden they start showing this video of people like breaking all of their popular secular CDs, like their music. And then after that, they're like, now go buy the praise music in the lobby. Right.
Go buy some Newsboys.
Yeah. So, right. Like it was one of those things where like, as a teenager, I was like, oh, is my mind being ruined by,
Knights in Satan's service?
Yeah. I mean, I'm like, I don't, as much as I would be kind of embarrassed to ride around blaring Green Day at this point in my life. I'm not sure that it was the thing that like ruined me theologically. So, but sort of all kidding aside on that stuff, if you are going to the same place for all of your answers and all of your media content and creation, then it's very likely that message is going to become really uniform. And it allows for, I think, more extreme interpretations and a deviation, or at least a larger resistance to pluralism, because you're not engaging the ideas of others as often, and it's sort of an intentionally set up media ecology that is meant to be more limiting, might be the way to say it. But that's the thing, I mentioned television earlier, right? And you look at the progression of these things, and you look at these larger churches, and even now the smaller denominations. The spread of these messages, I think, is really tied to the way in which each generation becomes a little bit more media savvy and has access to yet another form of media that they can then polish the message and kind of move it along, right? So some of the, promotional materials that may have been spread in the 1950s by, say, like John Birch Society folks who were connected to churches across the country, right? They're going to look like those pamphlets that are not really well produced, and it's going to be kind of easy to go like, everybody's got that uncle that'll pass you like, if you want to know the truth, here's the thing, and they would hand you that thing, and you're like, I don't know, this looks a little sketchy, or they hand you something about the Clinton. An old VHS tape that looks like it's about to fall apart, claiming that the Clintons have murdered, everyone. And it's a little easier to discern, right? Because the media doesn't it doesn't match the grandiosity of the claim. But as you can produce more and more polished media, and it looks the way that it's supposed to look, and it feels like a news channel, or it feels like an authoritative source, or the books are being published by a press that is putting out, lots of titles that, appear, like something that you pull off the shelf at Barnes and Noble. I think that makes a difference.
Yeah. So, help me understand Pete Hegseth's connection to the church. Is he BFFs with Doug Wilson, or is he just an attendee at a
He's a member of a church in Tennessee that is part of the CREC. In terms of a formal connection with Doug Wilson, I'm not aware of they've gone golfing together or something, nothing like that. But I mean, the churches are going to, because of that media ecology that I was talking about, be sending or spreading similar messages and staying within certain theological and ideological precepts. Hegseth, says he sort of found religion in the late 20-teens. That was sort of an antidote to some of the personal struggles and problems that he was having. That was one of the things that he said had changed him and made him a better fit for the job that he has now than he might have previously been. It was finding religion and being a Christian. And his media persona in the book that he wrote, American Crusades, right? The title is telling, I think, in and of itself, right?
I didn't realize that he wrote a book with the same name as a book that Andrew Seidel wrote.
Yeah. And I mean, lots of people have picked up that crusade metaphor in various ways and run in very different directions with it. So, but yes, so he very much begins to make commentary on how educational processes are failing us, and how secular schools, right? You see this term being used more often than it had been previously used. And that comes out of the Christian reconstructionist model that then Doug Wilson has picked up on, right? But you even see Hegseth beginning to use some of that language, and some of the people around him using that language. And why I think that's really important for the Department of Defense is they run a ton of educational and training programs, not only for the people in the military, but the children who are on military bases across the country and the world, right? So there's going to be, there could very easily be an imprint that moves more towards what you might find in, these accreditation bodies associated with Wilson in terms of the classical Christian schools and that model. So Hegseth's connection, I think, is there through his emphasis on education, but also his emphasis on gender. I mean, there's a heavy component to where In his confirmation hearings, he said that he would not remove women from combat roles so long as it hit a certain performance standard. Those combat roles or the tests were at certain physical performance standards. Well, he's already revisiting some of those standards, right? And there is a sense in which, the CREC, and Doug Wilson is very explicit about women being submissive to men, both in the household and more explicitly sexually. He's written extensively about that as well. Where I think, that begins to you see some of that bleeding in, right? You see some of that, what I would consider to be, misogynist approach to whether a woman can do a job or not. I mean, I'm certainly not going to make it through special forces training myself. If a woman can pass all the physical tests for that, good for her. But you see a lot of that. And I mean, if you go back and watch some of his Fox and Friends clips, he's very vehement about, the decline of the military is intimately tied to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And that's often offered with very little evidence or no evidence at all. And then, the other aspect of this is the erasure of trans people. And discriminatory practices towards LGBTQ folks in the military, scrubbing Harvey Milk's name from a ship, these sorts of things where I can't think of a way that wouldn't be tied to his affiliation with this kind of church and with this kind of theology.
Are you aware of any other agencies within the government that has done, similar types of actions that Pete Hegseth has done, but is not connected to the CREC? And in essence, I'm looking to see if we did a gap analysis, of what he did and what, I don't know, Kristi Noem did. I'm just throwing a name out there, compare apples to apples. Would Pete Hegseth have done more things that are consistent with the CREC than somebody that wasn't connected? If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, the Heritage Foundation wrote Project 2025. And I'm not going to say that that's a complete overlap in terms of a Venn diagram and circles, but there aren't, there might be some daylight, but there's not a ton, right? But I think that goes back to one of the things that I kind of brought up earlier, where you talk about the way that these smaller denominations begin to coalesce under some of these larger titles of the religious right or the Christian right, and they don't necessarily have to be the same denomination. They don't necessarily have to be producing the same exact materials if they're coming to the same ultimate conclusions. And this is one of the things that I think really you see in a different way post-1979. Randall Balmer talks about this in some of his work in terms of the ways in which the Christian right was formed, and there was a move away from opposing segregation and to taking a particular stance on abortion. So as that was happening, one of the other things that happened is a lobbyist named Paul Weyrich is in the background, and he gets it to where the political apparatuses begin exchanging mailing lists with religious denominations that they think are theologically kind of in line with their political project. So you began to see this sort of cross-pollination with certain groups and churches with the Republican Party, so that by the time you get to the mid-'80s, you've got Ronald Reagan turning around in First Baptist Dallas and looking at W.A. Criswell and going, I know that you can't endorse me, but I endorse what you all are doing here. Right. So, when you talk about the Johnson Amendment, I'm sure that'll come up. Right.
Yes.
But even that is a huge shift, right? Because Criswell had opposed JFK's candidacy for the presidency because he didn't want the papacy to control the presidency. There should be a separation between church and state. By the time Reagan comes around, a CBS interviewer, I believe it's CBS, asked Criswell, you said this stuff about Kennedy. What makes Reagan different? And Criswell his response was, the separation of church and state is the figment of some infidel's imagination. Right. So you see, even within a more traditional Southern Baptist denomination, a pretty huge shift in terms of the way that narrative is being spoken about, as certain types of political power are accumulated and then tied to certain religious entities.
Here's kind of I guess just a blunt or direct question, is especially given, like, whenever you talk about Christian nationalism, and this has been my experience, it's such a broad term. It refers to a lot of different things, and unless like you've spent your career studying it, or pick up a book, and read about it, like, it's easy to just pass off as just another whatever political weapon, that the libs or somebody's using. So, like, when people think about the CREC, should they be afraid? Should they be, should it just be something on folks' radar? If a person's listening to this and they are attending a church that is a CREC church, which I found out there's one in Virginia, apparently, down by Lynchburg, surprisingly. So, like, how should people view the CREC if they're coming into this cold and they know nothing about them?
That's a hard question.
I know.
I mentioned Heath Drusen's reporting earlier, and his podcast, Extremely American, season 2 focuses on Moscow in particular, and he interviews people in Moscow who are, as they refer to themselves, Kirkers, which is a Scottish word for church. So people who are members of Christ Church are Kirkers. And a lot of them, just kind of want to go about their everyday lives, and they have their small businesses, and they work in their various places that they work, and don't appear to be theologically that divergent from anybody that you would be kind of meeting on a normal basis that attends church regularly. But on the other hand, you've got these claims of abuse and the claims of covering up abuse within Moscow, and whole networks of people that are set up to get women in particular out of Moscow and across state lines into Washington, where the laws are more favorable in terms of someone being able to handle certain types of domestic abuse. I don't think those kinds of networks would exist if there wasn't a need for it, So I don't want to paint in too broad of strokes about individual members of any given church, because you run into all sorts of problems as soon as you do that, especially with there being space for dialogue to continue in certain areas. But I do think it's important to know where some of these ideas are coming from, right? So, Canon Press, there's a book by a guy named Joe Rigney that's, making claims about how dangerous empathy is, and that empathy is a trap, right? I think that's super toxic politically, right? If we can't take the positions of other people while we're engaging in deliberations, and we're always treating it as warfare, and then you couple that with a version of masculinity that is extremely given to sort of patriarchal structures and discriminatory structures, then it's pretty easy to see where things can go wrong if the arguments are taken to their end. Right? So, I mean, this is when you begin looking at kind of the telos or the teleology of the argument in terms of where does this go if we take it all the way to the end. It goes to a country that is monolithic in terms of religious belief, political belief. There's not room for dissent. Now Wilson would say, that people who are atheists would have more freedom under their government because of the way that the state would operate. It weren't operating as a Christian society. I find that claim hard to believe, especially when you're just out of hand saying, if you're Jewish, you can't hold office. If you're Muslim, you can't hold office. If you're, agnostic, you can't hold office, right? That's a pretty open form of discrimination right up front.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen Wolfe said on our show that if you are not Christian, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, atheist, Muslim, whatever, like you should be marginalized. And I'm assuming that came straight out of his book. I can't remember exactly, but
it is in the book. Yes. You're very close to. I'm. Forgive me, I can't recite from memory that book for any number of reasons, but yeah. No, I mean it's pretty overt. And then some of the more extreme conclusions that are then arrived at if you disagree with that notion of statecraft and state building, you get pretty quickly to like very punitive notions of it's not just marginalization, right? And in terms of this person doesn't have the same type of voice. It's if they use their voice, we will silence them.
Yeah. So what's next for the CREC? And, what's your sense of their involvement with the midterms coming up?
I mean, I'm sure they'll run the same kind of press campaigns that they've been running for years in terms of, having merchandise associated. They'll have a run of books come out in relation to whatever the hot button topic or issue and using, whatever the vocabulary du jour is in terms of what people should be afraid of during this election cycle. But I do think some of it will depend on, Hegseth's role. If you go and look at some of the reporting and whether or not he and Trump are getting along, there's conflicting reports. Whether or not he and the rest of the cabinet are getting along, it seems like there's pretty clearly some rifts happening there. There's the larger political trajectory. I don't have that crystal ball, but I do think Hegseth's positioning, especially as we become more involved in certain places in the world rather than, less involved. So it's going to matter, right? So what happens in Ukraine, what continues to happen in Israel and Palestine and Iran. And, we can go through the list here in terms of the Department of Defense plays a huge role in America's role in the world more broadly. If the person who's in charge of it or who can make decisions, even sometimes, if this week's reporting is to be believed on Ukraine, make decisions without the president being aware of those decisions having been made, then the influence, from the ideological frame of the CREC could be huge.
Wow. Yes. So the CREC does not sound like a normal. Maybe that's a bad way to frame it. Like it doesn't seem like it's a part of the traditional kind of mainline Christian church. Definitely not like the church that Josh runs. So I'm a little bit nervous. I agree. It's probably too premature to be completely afraid. But I think that if you're somebody that follows the faith and politics world, that the CREC Church is one definitely to follow. Thank you so much for coming on our show.
Happy to.
This has been really, really good. Anything you're working on that you want to let our audience know about?
My colleague Carolyn Robbins and I are working on a book on the expansion of the industrial prison complex and the way in which during the Nixon and Reagan administrations, religious language was used to kind of justify that expansion, which we're seeing some distressing developments on that front in terms of detention facilities and whatnot, the way that those things are being constructed now. So I think there'll be some through lines in that research.
Like the DHS showing a video with like Bible verses and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, like that. And then I've got a project that I've been working on for a while, looking at the way in which civil suits are used and the aftermath of killing people of color by law enforcement, and the rhetoric surrounding that, the way that those justifications end up being used, and how taxpayer money is being spent in relation to that. So one day I'll write about something happy, but not any day soon. So yeah, I'm working on those things, and then just continuing probably too many other side projects, but.
Aren't we all? Well, thanks again, Sam, for coming on our show. It's been a real pleasure just getting to know you and talk about the CREC.
Likewise. Thank you.
And to our audience and listeners, hey, thanks so much for stopping by and joining us. As always, make sure you keep your conversations not right or left, but up, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Hey there, Josh Bertram here, faithful host of the Faithful Politics Podcast. I want to let you know about a compelling new spinoff, the Faith Roundtable, where I'll be interviewing top faith leaders, theologians, and scholars to unpack the pressing issues that are shaping the church in America today. We'll dive into topics like faith in public life, social justice, and how we can engage our communities more effectively. Make sure you don't miss any of our enlightening conversations by subscribing to it on our YouTube channel. Join me at the Faith Roundtable, where deep discussion meets thoughtful insight.